All right, our final lecture or chunk of our lecture today in this tour de force of Indian philosophy, in which we've discovered up to this point, we've learned about the enumeration school of Sankhya. We've also learned about yoga and how yoga sort of is a practical way to enact the disunion, if you will, of Sankhya to get rid of the connection of Purusha and Prakriti. We talked about Advaita Vedanta and we've talked about Tantra. So now we're going to talk about Bhakti. So what is Bhakti? Let's get into it. So Bhakti is sort of an intriguing thing because it's in many ways it's a big deal in India, and it has become in many ways sort of the dominant paradigm, not of philosophy, but of a philosophy that's profoundly theological and is based on practice. So from the Sanskrit, we have the root bhuj, which means to share. Now, Bhakti is generally described as devotionalism. And their idea of devotionalism is that one becomes so one-pointed on God that one shares in God. That one shares, they share in the essence of God. They're so devoted to his memory, to his events, to his or her images. So it's very much like a Hindu monotheism in the sense that there's lots of gods still, but the one that you are the most drawn to, the one you share with, that is the one that you are hyper-focused on. And you focus on sort of bringing up these emotional states of feeling the love of God, feeling love of God for you, feeling God's love for others, feeling and sharing in that, those emotions of love from God. One famous guy used to always say, he was a Bengali poet, but my teacher, John Grimes, would say the same thing. He says, I want to taste sugar. I don't want to be sugar. He didn't want to die and become unified with God. He wanted to die, and Bhakti people will say, I want to die and I want to go to Vaikuntha heaven and just be near Krishna. I just want to hang out out there. I want to spend my days hanging with Krishna, doing his thing, just being around God. I love God. I just want to be with God. I don't want to become an undifferentiated soul within God. I want to be with God. So while on earth, I want to share in the play of God, the memory of God. So when they go to a temple, they'll take darshan, which is viewing. So in that moment, you go before the image, and the image looks at you, and you look at the image, and the idea is you share a moment. This is a bhakti idea. You share that moment. God looks at you, you look at God, you share that moment. You share, you have that devotional sharing with God. So how do people interact with God in this way? Well, here's three ways right here in these pictures when we're dealing with Krishna. So you have God as a lover, sort of where the lover is absent. You're just waiting for his return so much. So in this case, we see Radha and Krishna. I'll talk about Radha and Krishna a little bit more. And Delmonico wrote, I thought, a really nice translation of sort of the play between Radha and Krishna. What about God as a child? You can imagine God as a child that you're completely devoted to doting on. You can imagine God as a mythological figure, such as on the left, you have Krishna talking to Arjuna and revealing his universal form. This is a key point in the Bhagavad Gita. And some people, and this was written there, and I think it's kind of silly, say God as the self. But I don't buy it. Nobody really does that. So you have all of these options to relate to God, and the goal of bhakti isn't as much to have the right relationship with God, but the one that gives you the most emotional status. Like there was a saint named Chaitanya that was so devoted to Radha that he, as a male, would dress as a woman, was even said to lactate. He would become so enmeshed in the love of that goddess that he would become like her. So bhakti is sort of extreme but not pathological devotion toward and love toward God. So God, as we read the story of Radha and Krishna, God sports. He takes Leela, the dance. He's carefree. Now, humans work. We have to work and do things and be in the world, and it's put upon us, and we have to suffer. But God, when he's in the world, is good. Krishna's just like, I'm good, man. I'm gonna go hang out with Radha and the other gopis, little milkmaids. I don't know, maybe I'll go wrestle with my buddy Balaram. I'll go milk some cows. Whatever, life's good. I'm unencumbered. I'm not suffering. I'm God. So we're supposed to remember the story of God as he sports, of God at play. When he's hanging out with his friends, when he's at work, when he's making love with Radha, or when he's missing Radha so much. Our essential nature, in fact, is the love of God and his beloved. So the story is of Radha Krishna. So Radha is actually not Krishna's wife. He's married to someone else. And there is an Indic notion that to really have powerful romantic love does not happen between a husband and wife. Remember that this idea of romantic love that we're obsessed with in the West isn't really found in India, though it's definitely found there now. So the idea was they were having an illicit dalliance. And Radha loves Krishna, Krishna loves Radha, and they pine for each other so much when they're separated. And then when they're together, it's just this perfect thing. And all of Radha's pals are around to support them and help them get away and support their amorous love making, you know, slather them up with unguents and make everybody's got pretty makeup on, give them like little pan and betel, which is like an areca nut that you kind of chew on. It gives your head a little buzz. I chew it when I'm in India. But yeah, and then their idea of their lovemaking is like this, you know, this glorious, tender thing, but it's also like a battle where they're sort of fighting against one another in their rapturous love and raking their nails on one another and biting each other's lips. So it's this powerful, amorous embrace. And the idea is that that is this like pure version of God and God's love. And you're supposed to feel yourself in Krishna and feel yourself in Radha, and then to realize that God made all of this world, and that all around us all the time, if we could see clearly, is God in his most pure state, which is being in love with his beloved. And in fact, a good bhakta can learn to see God in all things and see God's dance with his beloved in all things. So they'll associate everything they have in their lives to these sort of stories about God and God's love, and then find themselves just enraptured in the memory of these things, seeing that as the essence of all being. Now, my guy John Grimes here on the right, this is a picture of him, his son, and his wife Meera. John was my first Hinduism teacher. Anytime I make it to Tamil Nadu, I stay with him. I love this man to death. He's an Advaita Vedanta fundamentalist, and I love him for it, whatever. But I remember one time, you know, I said, yeah, but don't you want to not come back? Isn't that the whole goal, to not come back? And he looks at me and he's kind of puts his hands like this, and he looks into the sky and he sort of nods. This is a very John Grimes thing, like this. He said, I could come back. I could come back as a cat. I'd be Krishna's cat. I'd sit on his lip, or I'd sit on his waist. I'd sit on his lap. I'd tickle his lips with my whiskers. I'll come back as Krishna's cat, which I always thought was endearing. So I don't know if you can see Krishna's cat on the delightful old guy on the right. So our second piece that we read is by Cutler. It's on Tamil devotionalism. I'm going to read some of the poetry out of here because it's kind of great. So this is classic stuff by Manika Kavachara, which means something like the one with the one who speaks incredibly well. I don't know Tamil very well. And he was writing in the 9th century. So Manika Kavachara was wandering about South India, and he heard these women singing these songs. And they're these beautiful songs to God, to Shiva, in fact, but they were singing them as they were playing a game. The funny thing is we can't figure out what the game is. We got some guesses, but we don't really know what the games are. But we have beautiful poetry that sort of makes sense of some of the many ways that people could think of Shiva and be devoted to Shiva. Now, being devoted to Shiva is not like being devoted to Krishna. Shiva is a little more ambivalent. Shiva, you know, I mean, there's some discussion of Shiva copulating with his consort, and through their love making them generating the world. And people have sort of devotional stuff about that, but not really. I mean, it's not sexual in the same way, despite his overt sort of erotic asceticism. So Shiva in Manika Kavachara's text is described in a bunch of ways. He's described as being very distant, not connected to the world in any way, except for his devotees. If you're devoted to him, if you share in love for him, he will be close to you. He's described as the source of all the Vedas. So, you know, he himself would be, you know how I said that the Vedas are apaurusheya, they're not written by anyone. In some of these poems, he's described as being the source of the Vedas. So again, we have earlier religious ideas that are being recoded onto deity figures mostly with the goal of making these deity figures so big. He's got to be the source of all the Vedas. He's got to be all loving. He's got to be all these things to be Shiva, to be the grand god that one's associated to. The source or essence of all things. He is what all things have come from. Sometimes he's described as being like a master to us, to the devotees, as the servants, as like the owners to slaves, as the rulers to subjects. Other times he's described as a destroyer of karma, preventing rebirth. Shiva doesn't want you to come back as his cat. He will destroy all of your bad karmas. He will send you to a liberated state. He'll do the work for you. One way, the sense that bhakti is often described is that you just be devoted to God. God does the spiritual work for you and gets you liberated where you need to go. It's not like your initial endeavors, your hard work at spirituality will get you anywhere. And a bhakta would say, why would I want to do that? He can do it better, and he loves me, so he'll just do it for me. So it's an interesting spin on what we've seen thus far. So the devotion to God is able to compensate for any other lacks, but it's also seen to be a better way to get united with God that has control over everything in the first place. So let's look at a few poems. So poem number 8, and I've selected a few of these to just write out. The Lord who dances facing south at Tilai's little hall takes delight in women. He's a madman, my dear. Stupid girl, if he didn't take delight in women, all who live on this great earth would aspire to the yoga of heaven and leave this world behind. Don't you see? So the love of women for God makes them not want to go to heaven. Aha! Otherwise, if God wasn't so cool and didn't engage in sort of worldly things, maybe everyone would just go off to heaven and there'd be nothing left. Poem 12. Even a mother's love can't compare with the mercy of the Lord, who paid attention to me, though I am lower than a dog. Will pick flowers for my ruler, who slashed away birth's illusion and threw dust in the mouth of my stubborn deeds. So in here, God is beloved because he will bestow a freedom from illusion, a freedom from Maya, and will cast across one's karmas, even though you're lower than a dog. Poem 24, Platonicum, I can't remember what that is. So the world may know the glory of the hunter, who cooled the Lord's body and received his grace. Though his feet were shod, not shot, shod, his mouth carried the Lord's water, and his offering was flesh. His worship shone as if he knew the learned books. So this is actually an older Tamil story in which there is a hunter. Hunters are generally thought to be pretty low caste, and he comes across an image of Shiva, and he sees that this image of Shiva is alive and needs water, so he carries water in his mouth to him, and he gives him an offering of meat that he's cut apart from his kill. And Brahmin comes by and says, whoa, you've made that impure by putting that water in your mouth, and God does not take meat offerings. And God turns to him and says, what do you know? His devotion is so strong that he gave me water from his mouth, and he gave me the best of what he had to offer. So he's greater than all of your learning and all of your purity. Poem 31. Oh, girls wearing stacks of glittering bangles, sing about the Lord of stainless reputation, the compassionate Lord who frees us from birth and death, united with the goddess who speaks gentle words. See, so we have a goddess in here. He enters the hearts of his servants and bathes them in nectar. The Lord, leader of the gods, whose throat holds deadly poison. Shiva is thought to swallow poison, which turns his throat blue, and by swallowing that poison, he keeps the whole world from being poisoned. With towers that touch, dwells in northern Kochamakai, the town brilliant as a jewel with towers that touch the clouds. Let's ride the golden swing. So in this, we see the Lord even more so. We see him sort of mediated by a goddess who speaks nicely. That's a nice thing because he's a little kind of tough and scary. And we see that he enters into his people and bathes them in nectar, giving them solace and this compassion. And he's compassionate for people and frees them from birth and death. So finally, I wanted to tell you a story called The Littlest Devotee, or Bhairava Came for Dinner. Bhairava is a wrathful form of Shiva that either looks like a yogi. Well, he often looks like a yogi. He rides a dog. He carries a club. He has Brahma's head stuck to one of his hands. The story is that he and Brahma got into an argument, and Shiva took his fingernail and cut off Brahma's 5th head. And he got the head stuck on his finger, and he committed the sin of killing a Brahmin. So then he had to wander the earth until he found a place where it was a holy place where the head of Brahma dropped off of his hand and fell into this sacred well. It's called Kapila Mochana. It's in Benares. But then lots of pictures will have him holding Brahma's skull still, sometimes with a delightful dog, but sometimes licking Brahma's skull. Sometimes he uses Brahma's skull as a begging bowl. So the story of the littlest devotee, there's this man who's very devoted to God, just loves God, loves Shiva so much. Shiva, 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 Shiva. It's all Shiva. Him and his wife can't have a kid. And then through the grace of Shiva, they beg Shiva, and Shiva gives them a child. And their child is a perfect little boy, just absolutely delightful in every way, the apple of everyone's eye. Well, one day a yogi comes to dinner, and he's scary looking. And he says to them, he says, I am a yogi. I'm a representative of Shiva. I might as well be Shiva. Go kill your son, cook him up, and make me dinner. And the littlest devotee, this little man, says, all right, and he does it. And the story, they just dramatically describe is cutting this child's body up, breaking its bones open for marrow and whatnot, and making this stew for this cannibal yogi. And he gives the stew to the yogi slurps it right down and says, you are the most devoted of all, that you would offer your son to me, who may or may not be Shiva. And then he reveals himself, he is Shiva. And then Shiva brings the child back to life, and the husband and wife and child live happily ever after. The glory of devotion. Being devoted to God will get you all things. So there you go. Go share a beer with Bhairava. Bhairava likes beer. You see right here, that's a picture of Bhairava, I think in Western, or maybe Eastern India, I'm not sure. But he drinks pots of beer. In Kathmandu, during his sacred festivals, there's one place I like to go where they actually pour beer into like his head, and then he spits beer out of the idol's sort of mouth, because they poured beer through a tube in his head, and everybody tries to catch the beer in their mouths. It's very exciting. All right, have a wonderful day. I'll catch you next time.